You're listening to the RN Mentor, a podcast designed to document and bring you the work and experience of some of the most influential nurses in our profession. We will be sitting down and having a discussion with the leaders of today's nursing world as they share their work, how they navigate their nursing path, and their views on the future of the profession. My name is Ali Tayeb. I am a registered nurse, United States Navy veteran, a Jonas Veterans Healthcare Scholar, and your host for the RN Mentor. Hello and welcome to another episode of the RN Mentor podcast. I am ecstatic to be joined today by Dr. Margaret Moss. Dr. Moss is a University of Minnesota School of Nursing professor and Associate Dean for Nursing and Health Policy. Dr. Moss is an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa and Arikara Nation with equal lineage in Dakhóta First Nation. She is the first and only American Indian to hold both nursing and juris doctorates. She has been a nurse for 34 years and an academic for 23 years across 4 universities, including the University of Minnesota, Yale University, SUNY Buffalo, and recently the University of British Columbia. Dr. Moss was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellow, staffing the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging, a Fulbright Research Chair at McGill University, Montreal, and on a Minister of Health for British Columbia team on anti-Indigenous racism, resulting in the report titled In Plain Sight. Dr. Moss published an award-winning text, American Indian Health and Nursing, in 2015, co-led the development of the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan in 2020, was named to the inaugural Forbes 50 over 50 impact list in 2021, is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing and a member of the American Academy of Nursing's Board of Directors, and is a new member of the National Academy of Medicine. Her areas of interest are aging, policy, and law with a focus on American Indian and other Indigenous and diverse populations. Welcome to the show, Dr. Moss.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So I want to start, first of all, congratulations on your becoming a new member of the National Academy of Medicine. And is it true you were the only nurse that was a new member?
No, I think there was at least one other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still very underrepresented, I think.
Right.
But thank you. Congratulations, though, on that. We'll get started with my normal, my regular questions. Is how did you decide you're going to have a career in the world of nursing?
Sure. Well, I grew up with an adopted family. I spoke about this some in a talk I did for AAN a couple of years ago. That is the product of actually assimilation policies in the U.S., which is adoption of American Indians into non-Indian families that lasted over decades. It is currently against federal law. So the way I grew up is against federal law today. So I was adopted by a couple who were of German and English descent. My father, the adoptive father, was a neurosurgeon, and my mother was a nurse. So what are you going to do? So that's the context I grew up in, and I always loved science, math, all that sort of stuff. And when I was growing up, of course, the house was filled with medical journals, anatomy books, and those fun old-timey ones where there was like transparencies in the middle of the books. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. And you could overlay the digestive system and all that. Anyway, yes. I just thought it was very fun. So I remember like memorizing all the bones of the body in 5th or 6th grade, things like this. So I just knew that that's what I did for fun. So I knew I was going to go down that path somewhere. So I did get my first degree in biology while I was sorting all of this out. And during college, I would, however, work as a CNA. Back then, I go so far back, they were just NAs. There was no C back then. And I really enjoyed it. I loved working with the older people. I loved doing it. And it was just sort of filed in my background. And so then I went to a program that served American Indians wanting to go into medicine.
Mm.
And so I started, and I'm not naming it for a reason, although one could probably figure it out. Anyway, so I went there for pre-professional, like you want to go into medical school, because although I had a biology degree, it didn't hit all the prerequisites one would need. And, during this time, I beefed up and did the MCATs and all that, did well. I had several interviews at Michigan, Brown, and this place. Anyway, but when I was interviewing at this place, and I'm saying this to give you hints as to why I didn't go this direction. The people interviewing me were saying, well, why should you be in this program? Sort of thing. Like, you were adopted, so you're not really Indian is the implication, right?
Oh, wow.
Like the minute I went out onto the street, the general public would say, "Oh, you were adopted by white people. You're fine." No, 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 no. So anyway, I thought, I'm not sure
Wow.
this is quite the place for me. So I instead, although I did interview at some of those places, all of those places, I took a position. It was another program at also I won't name this, but I'm sure you could also figure this out because I had all these things happen to me along the way. So I went to do research in the East, famous place. And so I was like helping the scientists because I just had my biology degree at this point with their protocols. I was ripping DNA out of lung cells and then putting, carcinogens on them and, getting DNA out and so forth, this kind of stuff. And one of the scientists there didn't like something that happened, although it wasn't me. They blame me. This sounds terrible, but anyway, it all got cleared up and it wasn't me, whatever this thing was. And but then the person, this is a scientist, this is a, august scientist who told me, "Oh, you should just go." Well, he said it to someone else as I walked in the room. "Why don't you go back to the reservation and chew leather?" This
Wow.
is a famous place scientist. So I
Right.
thought, maybe medicine isn't the area for me, because I just keep getting all these. So in the school place, I wasn't Indian enough. And in this place, I was too, and I'm like, what the hell?
Wow.
So anyway, I mean, what the heck? So I started to remember, you know what? I really liked nursing at the level that I had been doing it. And I really admired my mother, who was always like the neighborhood nurse, the school nurse, all that, because there were 5 kids in my family growing up, and so she wasn't, and it was a different time. She wasn't outside working, but she always did the nurse thing. So I said, you know what? I think I'm going to try nursing school. So I went back west where I had been living and decided, let's do it. And so that's how I started.
Wow. Amazing. Um, it's ironic that now you're a member of the National Academy of Medicine
Right.
when when
Don't think I didn't think of that. I'm like, I
yeah.
wonder what those guys are doing now. But anyway,
Yeah. Hopefully they're no longer doing anything.
yeah,
Uh, but yeah, it's amazing how exclusive we tend to be in the healthcare field, and even in nursing. There's areas that are still exclusive. It just reminds me, being male in a primarily female profession. I've had nurses in leadership roles that have specifically said men. I don't think men belong in nursing.
Wow.
So not to the same level, obviously. But again, I can the exclusions that we create within healthcare, it just seems counterproductive to our own profession. So it's interesting things like this happen. How was your experience as somebody who had that Native American lineage or Native lineage? How did that translate into while you were in the nursing program? Did that impact it at all? Because I know professors and academia tends to be very white.
Right. White and female. Yes,
White and
right.
female.
So, yeah, just as a little context. So again, I was born in North Dakota and but adopted then. My father was with the VA. Actually, I'm a VA brat. I notice you have a veteran
I did.
bent. So I grew up on VAs and VA properties. And anyway, but so lots of moving. So in my first 3 years from birth till three, Fargo VA, Milwaukee VA, several Pittsburgh VAs, and then to DC. So we moved to DC and when I was 3, and because my father was at the central office, he was pretty high up. And then and I say that to say there weren't many natives in Washington, D.C. in the 60s, which is when I was 3. And so therefore, there was no other, and sometimes I'll flip back and forth with the vernacular to Indian. But anyway, there weren't any other Indian students. There weren't any Indian teachers. There weren't any Indian, and we went to a Catholic school and a congregation, and practically the whole neighborhood was the congregation. No other persons, no community members, no priests, no sisters, nothing.
Wow.
So there were 2 other kids adopted with me. They were actual brother and sister, and they're from the same reservation. Anyway, so we were it. I mean, we were the only other Indians I saw were them. So, we were like our own little urban reservation, I guess. So this carried on. Then he was transferred to Portland, the Portland VA. That's where exactly my high school years again. I think there was actually one brother and sister in the high school that I went to, but
Wow.
who were Native, and that was it. But again, I've never had a Native teacher, hospital situation, just nothing. So by the time I got to nursing school, and I went to a 2-year to start out because back in my day, there were none of these accelerate from this and accelerate from that, and if you already have a degree, so forth. No, you had to start over. And so it would have probably taken 3 years again after my first 4-year degree because everything's in order and there weren't any of these accelerate. So I did the 2-year ADN because I said, I just want to get in and get out. So anyway, I did that. And of course, there was nobody, nothing. And all that time through my biology degree, of course, and through the nursing program, never heard anything about natives as far as healthcare or issues or biology, nothing. And so that kind of stuck in my head. So anyway, when I came out, obviously, well, not obviously, oddly maybe, my first nursing position was at the Portland VA where I had grown up years before during my high school years. So that was kind of fun. But I soon said to myself, you know what? I think I want to work with natives. And since I was already a federal employee, I could do a federal transfer into Indian Health Service. So,
Yes.
and my husband was also getting a bit of the, what do you call it? The sad, because it rains in Portland all the time, or it's just drizzly and all that. And he's not into it. So we went, where doesn't rain? And I could be federal chance. So we moved to Albuquerque and I worked at the Santa Fe Indian Hospital for several years, 5 to 6. And then I transferred back to the Albuquerque VA. I just couldn't get out of those systems, I guess. Anyway, And I heard one of your other speakers saying that 60%, and maybe this is now, 60% of the nurses in Indian Health Service were Native. Well, when I went to the Santa Fe Indian Hospital, I was the second Indian RN. There was only the two of
Wow.
us. One that was there and not from the community. She was Navajo, and then me. And I was from the plains, since this is a New Mexican, you know.
Right.
Anyway, so that was interesting because it was just, there weren't any. There was me and one other person. So anyway, I worked there for several years, and now that I've talked so much, I forgot what the question was. Was
I
that?
don't know. I was actually asking about your experience as a
Oh
native
yeah,
individual,
yeah.
of how school was. So no, you answered it perfectly.
Okay.
So I mean that brings me to my, and I've asked this of several of my guests who've been on the show. Uh, how important do you think having representation within the schools of nursing, within academia, is to the students that are, for example, Native or Black or Filipino or any other race and ethnicity? How important is having that diversity within academia to the learner, in your opinion and experience?
Oh, it's extremely important. I mean, I just sort of white knuckled my way through all of my through all my experiences. I mean, I was it, you know. And then if the topic of your population comes up, if it comes up, and it mostly
Mm,
didn't, then all heads turn to you. And I mean, from third grade on, you know, every fall there's the, you know, Indian chapter or Columbus and Thanksgiving and all that. And everybody turns to look at you. You're like, I'm just in the class like everybody else. Anyway, I mean, that went on forever. So if it came up, everybody looks at you or asks you or whatever. You're like, I am just a student in this class. And then, but if there are others, then you don't have to represent your race. I
yeah,
mean, most dominant culture people don't have to represent their race, or if they do something, they just did something, not the entire race.
right.
Versus if you are it and you do something, then oh, Indians do this or that or
Mm,
whatever. So so yeah, it's a lot. It's, and people do talk about that now, about the burden of always having to explain or teach or whatever from wherever you are. If you're a nurse, a student, whatever, you have to teach whatever it is because the faculty don't know.
yeah,
You know, what are they going to do? So anyway, it's extremely important. And also just to have people to bounce things off of who get it immediately. You only say 3 words and they nod at you and you're like, yeah, I get. Whereas it would take 5 paragraphs to explain to somebody else.
right.
You know, so it's the shortcuts in living that people don't realize that they have, and just the comfort level, spreading around that who's going to answer something because you know they're going to ask. And that's, well, actually, I shouldn't say no, they're going to, often they don't ask. So, you know, this is rudimentarily, at least when I was going, I'm pretty sure it's a little better now, but if I learned anything in any of my nursing programs, and I, you know, 3 of them, the pre-licensure, master's, and PhD, it's, oh, they don't look you in the eye, which is so surface and vague. It's very much more complicated than that. It is, you know, tribe by tribe. Some the young don't look at the elder. Some an unmarried man can't look at, you know, this older woman, or you know, there's rules to it, and
Right.
some don't follow that at all. But that's might be what you learn. Or they want their hair back if you brush their hair. You know, there's no context. It's just picked out a couple of weird things, and so this is what prompted me to write the text and
Yeah.
or the publish the text, because no one ever learns anything, at least in any depth, on the indigenous populations. So
Right. And that's problematic. And I'm trying to relate to what you're sharing here. And I'm actually right now in the process of writing a veterans health chapter for a public health nursing book. because they didn't have it. It's a chapter that didn't exist before. And I'm trying to figure out exactly sort of what you mentioned is all the nuances between the different branches and the subcultures within those branches.
Absolutely.
And it's almost, and it does need its own book. And there is a book out there for veterans health stuff, but still, it's still just without the actual experience of being in the military, it's very difficult to translate that for the general public. So I'm sure it's very much the same thing with you. And I'm from the Middle East. I'm from Iran, and trying to explain that the entire Middle East is not one culture. It's all different cultures and traditions and history, and so I can relate to some of the things that you're mentioning.
And I could tell you a little story about the two, because I worked a lot in Indian health and in various VAs,
Right.
Portland, Albuquerque, and did some research at Houston during my doctorate in Santa Fe Indian Hospital and so forth. So I became eventually a nursing supervisor at the Indian Health Service Hospital, and boy, does that open your that was probably the basis of my book, was what I learned being there, because I only learned what anybody else learned. I learned just like anybody else. So that's where I got my first real understanding. So as a nursing supervisor, let's say somebody passes away, and so as a supervisor, you take them to the morgue and so forth. Now, if you were in a regular hospital, you would, there's probably something in there about funeral direction, where are they going to go and so forth and so on. Not there. And you wait for people from the trial. Sometimes they're 5 hours away to come batting across the mesa in their pickup. And then as the administrator, I would open up the morgue, but I really am not allowed to be in there because I'm the wrong gender, the wrong tribe, et cetera, et cetera. So they're doing what they do with blankets and ash and so forth, prayers, ceremony, and then they bring the person out, put it in the back of the pickup truck. One of my major duties is to make sure the doctor signs the death certificate and get it into that truck, or else they're just batting across the mesa with a body, So I'm like, where did they teach me this in nursing school?
They don't.
They don't. And
wow.
And then of course there's a lot of Indian religious acts and so forth, and so something happens on one of the pueblos, and this served like 11 pueblos, a little bit of Apache and Navajo, and there goes your entire food service staff, because even though in the US they might be deemed as having lower level jobs, but in their tribes they could be they could be, so off they go, and there you are. You're just sort of there, and you're like, okay, we'll take care of it.
Yeah.
And then the last one is like, when you have somebody transferred in, whether it's from Albuquerque VA or something else, here comes the helicopter. And I'd worked in several hospitals. I'm like, okay, the helicopter's coming, but it didn't occur to me, where's it going to go? Because this is like a single story hospital. And so again, the staffs, the support staff, there was a school, an Indian school next to us. They went out to the field, parked their trucks, turned on the headlights, and that's how the helicopter. Wow. So compare that to then I became a supervisor at the Albuquerque VA. There's no way you would let someone else into that morgue, only the administrative, person such as myself or whatever, or you have to accompany them if they want to see something. You couldn't. It was completely different rules, completely different rules. And then we kind of got caught every once in a while if there was a Native veteran. Are they going to go to Albuquerque VA? Are they going to go to the Santa Fe Indian Hospital? And there was all this back and forth. I don't even think anybody really asked the patient. These ones want to go here. These ones want to go there. So it's a whole thing with these federal systems.
Yeah, and I think I briefly when you and I first met, like earlier in the year, I've actually heard you speak several times. So thank you. And that's one of you've been on my bucket list to bring on the show for a while now. But I think the last time we connected when you were in LA, we mentioned like where the the Native population who are also veterans, are really not in the best place, because the federal regulations on who does what and who cares for this population is a little bit ambiguous, and a lot of times these veterans fall through the gaps of service, because the VA says you should be getting care at your tribal lands, and then the tribe saying, no, you're a veteran, you should be getting care at the VA, and these veterans actually don't end up like getting their care. It's significantly delayed, which is an issue.
Yeah, and I think I talked to the first stint when I was in Minneapolis, and I talked to some Native veterans, and they didn't necessarily want to go to the Minneapolis VA, but close by, according to my recollection, it's been a while, there's like a vet center or something, and they would go there, but they didn't necessarily want to go into the VA itself. And so there's some levels of acceptability,
Yeah.
So it is complicated. I don't think people have looked at it all that much.
There is some movement in the VA space, where, especially with psych mental health services, there's a new policy that just got passed, where the VA has representation within their VA facilities for Native populations to address some of those very like nuances that you mentioned. But we're still not where we need to be, like not even close. But thank you for that. I want to talk about your decision to go for, like, for example, your master's or your PhD and actually get into research. What prompted you to move that direction?
So again, when I went to the Indian hospital, I was most interested in the elders. I guess a holdover from my CNA days, even though I didn't have any Indian elders there, but I was very interested in why they would literally, so we try to discharge them into some sort of care, and they didn't want to go. They would only want to go home. And most of the care, if not all, at that time, this was the 90s, was, as they say back there, Anglo or Hispanic. Those were their choices. And they're like, no, because there wasn't really any native home health per se. There's still the public health nurses that go out after a discharge or something, but there wasn't anything solid back then. And they didn't want to go into Albuquerque or somewhere in Santa Fe. They just wanted to go home. And so I started looking at how could we do adult daycare with this population. So I decided to get my master's, and that was my capstone as like a business plan for Indian adult daycare that could be culturally and age relevant and so forth. Wow. And so therefore, they're only gone for the day or parts of the day. Like their family member could drop them off and then pick them up later. They're still at home or whatever. And while I was doing research on that, shout out to University of Texas, Houston, their gerontology program kept popping up in my searches and whatnot. And I said, well, let me give it a whirl. I mean, I had never, like some of your guests say, you just sort of fell from one thing to the next. I had never thought I was going to get a PhD. And so I thought, well, they have a specific gerontology. Let me give it a whirl. It's right next door. I thought, this is how dumb I was. So 1,200 miles later, Texas is huge.
It is.
Anyway, I got accepted, so I went to study this. My research questions were around why won't American Indian elders accept outside or out of culture care, and do gerontological theories fit with this population? And so I ended up doing a ethnography on the Zuni Pueblo, which is in a southern Pueblo. When I was at Santa Fe, there were like 11 northern Pueblos. So I didn't know much about Zuni, but it's a very, very traditional tribe. And so I thought, well, if I know what's going on there, and I was trained pretty much Western, people will follow along the continuum. So, I mean, the elders often or mostly speak their own language, as well as English, sometimes Spanish, sometimes the other Pueblo languages, their language is they are the only ones that speak it. It's called an isolate. They're the only ones in the world that speak it. The
Wow.
other Pueblos have some shared languages and Spanish. So anyway, so I went there to understand that.
Oh, amazing, amazing. I know um, I did a podcast a couple of years ago with the public health nurses in Alaska, and they shared some of the same sentiments about specific individual or specific tribes being the only ones speaking a language. And actually, that's how they disseminated some of their COVID vaccinations to preserve the languages of certain tribes, is just making sure that those tribes were not impacted, because being so few that speak like specific languages or cultures, if they had caught COVID and had died from it, that whole it would have been gone, right?
Right.
So they had spoken about that. So very interesting. My wife and my kids and I we do these little road trips, and we always make it a point to hit some of the national parks that have preserved some of the native, for example, buildings and structures. And I'm always um, very much impressed with how far how much they could do with just off the land. I'm like, I think
Yeah.
about that now, and I'm like, I probably would have a hard time building a fire in my backyard with
Right.
a
Right.
match.
Yeah.
So let
Yeah.
alone like building these incredible structures, and the culture is always blows my mind. So thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Um, how about your work now? You're doing work with the indigenous populations, and you're doing work with around aging. Can you share with the audience a little bit about the work that you're doing now
Sure.
and its impact on nursing and healthcare?
Well, actually, I'm coming back to it now. The last 5 years, I have been at University of British Columbia, and 80% of my job there was as director of the First Nations House of Learning,
Wow.
and 20% was in nursing as a professor at the School of Nursing. But most of my job had been Indigenous, the largest Indigenous unit under the provost. Up there, they have way more Indigenous stuff going on as compared to anything I've seen in the US anyway. And so, as part of that, and that was a provostial unit, as they say. So, I did spend 2 years working on the Indigenous Strategic Plan. I was co-lead, and so that took a lot of time talking to students, faculty, staff, community members, two campuses, and so forth, to figure out what to do. And so that was, and University of British Columbia is 70,000 to 80,000 people. There's a smaller campus and then the big one. And so we launched that in 2020, and that was launched to audiences around the world. I forget, I always mean to get that number, but I can never remember how many countries were watching at the same time. And so that was a huge thing that I was doing. And then for nursing up there, I was tapped to be on the investigation team for the Minister of Health on anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare in BC, because they had gotten reports of all sorts of things going on that shouldn't be going on. And so that was another year spent on that investigation and report. The final report is called In Plain Sight, Addressing Anti-Indigenous, because all this is happening literally in place. The community members see it, the other nurses see it, the family members, everybody sees it. But what are they going to do about it? So we have this data. It was like a almost 300-page report with lots of cases in it and so forth. And now it's moved on to the implementation phase with the minister. So now we've got the old what, now what, and or so what, now what. So they're carrying that on, and meanwhile I've moved back here. And during the move, sort of, I was on National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine consensus study called Federal I don't know, they changed the name, but the gist of it is federal policies as they contribute to racial and ethnic health inequalities in the U.S. It just came out in July. And of course, I was there to bring in the Indigenous perspective and issues and so forth. And so one of the things that, well, three recommendations that we came up with are: one, fund Indian Health Service fully. It's
Right.
sometimes as low as 40%. Sometimes I think now it's up to maybe 60 and 50. And it's not an R or D issue. No matter who's in, it's never funded at need. And or at whatever we say 100% is, it should actually be funded at like 125, because our numbers are so low and there's so much catching up to do. Highest, life expectancy or lowest life expectancies in several administrative areas of Indian Health Service, and raise the director of Indian Health Service up to the level of an assistant secretary of health, and reinstate the House side Indian Affairs Committee. Both the Senate and House sides went away, like, I don't know, let's say 70s. Senate came back eventually, House never has.
Wow.
And both R&D have been asked, and they're like, no, we're not bringing it. And those are the people that know something, because the representative side, reservations are in their backyards.
Yeah.
Versus Senate, who look at the whole state and they don't have probably as clear an understanding, but for whatever reason, people don't want to bring that back. So
interesting.
So anyway, those are sort of the broader things that I've been working on. And now that I'm back to school of nursing here in the U.S., I do want to start looking again at my aging population. I did oversee was the bridge liaison to the Board of Aging expert panel on aging, among a few others, but I've always been part of the aging expert panel throughout. I was inducted in 2008, so it's been a while. so I always keep it there in the the back of my head. So I'm going to be looking more at that again.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wanted to ask about, there's a lot of stuff going on in various states and trying to almost say, going backwards and trying to remove history and context with the, Native American population and other populations as well. What do you think, from your perspective, or what can nursing do as a profession to really step up? Because sometimes I feel like we're behind as far as how we engage politics and policies, and by the time like we say something, it's come and gone. What do you think nursing has to do, or in order to be a stronger advocate or be a stronger ally with the Native population?
Yeah, nursing has a huge voice, but I don't think they've recognized it yet. There are 3 million-ish, probably more, nurses, as compared to, last time I looked, it's been a while though, 700,000 physicians. Yet physicians have a voice up here and nurses are down here. If they actually use their voice, it would be like, and I say this in terms of population, Chicago versus Nashville, but they don't know they're Chicago yet. And so if people could get on the same page, there's some simple things that I learned in law school, administrative law, that I think all nurses, I'm going to have to write this someday, that all nurses should know, which is the notice, comment, rule mechanism, which is, if there's constant notices coming out, whether it's your state register or the federal register, comes out every day. And if nurses could just sign up, you can sign up in whatever state you're in and say, I want alerts on veterans. I want alerts on, nursing homes. I want alerts on whatever it is, pregnancy, blah, blah, blah. And you will get all the proposed rules coming out. And what you can do, there's a comment period, 30 to 90 days, whatever the specific one is. If you wrote your comment and sent it in, every, whether it's a state or federal, every comment has to be counted and recognized. So therefore, can you imagine there's 3 million, even if 1 million, even if 700,000 nurses commented on something and relatively in unison, that would become law. Because the way it goes is they notify you this is coming out, you comment, and then there's a final rule which has the strength of law. It is the law.
Right.
Most people think the law is the bill that comes out. No, it's the final rule after the comment period. And so, for instance, you hear so many nurses saying, "Oh, I can't do this because of my state, laws and what." Well, where were you? They had to put out a notice.
Right.
You had to say something, and then it becomes final laws. But nurses they don't, and I didn't either. That's why I went to law school. I'm like, what's going on here? So that drove me after my PhD to figure out what to do. But they use it more in Canada than here, but truth and reconciliation. And what they say is you need the truth before you can reconcile things. So here in the US, we don't have the truth yet. So if people could learn about this population, and that's why I did the book, and I did it by regions, not by body systems or lifespan, which are the usual nursing books, because every region is so different. An Indian isn't an Indian, etc. Right. And so there are 9 accepted cultural regions for American Indians and Alaska Natives in the US, and then I added a 10th, which is urban, because most people are off reservation now. As of, I think, the 90 census, they were 50-50 or maybe a little off, and now they're 78% off or something. So people need to understand the regions and what's happening. So I tell people you can't know about everything. There's 574 federally recognized tribes. A lot of people don't even know that. And you can't know the nuances of all of them. But if, let's say, you're in a state, know the tribes in your state and what you might likely come across or what they might need, or understand that thing about, are they members of federally recognized tribes, state recognized, or they're unrecognized, or whatever. You have to know something to be able to help them, even on a rudimentary level. And I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you. And it's very true. Like Los Angeles has one of the largest Native American populations, but they're in LA. They're not living necessarily on tribal land. So very true. Very insightful. I do have a question. As you were talking, something popped into my brain. We're seeing, and I've heard you speak several of these land acknowledgements, and I appreciate the fact that that's been brought into the fold. But sometimes it feels very. It doesn't feel like we're doing enough by simply just doing a land acknowledgement. And I think a lot of maybe institutions have said, well, we did the land acknowledgement. So thanks very much. We're good. And it's something, I appreciate the land acknowledgement, but I don't always feel like the warm and fuzzies that everybody else may feel as a result of it. What was the purpose? Like, I know that I know the purpose, but in your opinion, what was the purpose for the land acknowledgements coming into place, and what's next? Like, I hear the land acknowledgements. What can I do more?
Sure. And there's so many ups and downs about the land acknowledgement, or so many sides to it, or whatever. And it's way more prevalent in Canada. So it's just, I know what you're saying. It could become rote, just like, oh, we have to say this, and so we're going to say it, without even knowing what the words coming out of your mouth or what it means. So for instance, where I just came from, we were on Musqueam territory. And so we would say, we're on the traditional unceded ancestral lands or whatever. And then we would stop and say, especially if we're talking to students, what does unceded mean? And they'd heard this 1,000 times. Everybody says this at every meeting, everywhere, all the time. And they're like, well, I don't know. So I said, so that's one of the next things. What do the words mean in this thing? Go look something up. Go look up current context. What are the Musqueam doing right now? You can't just do the language. So it goes again with that truth and reconciliation.
Right.
It's not everything or enough. It's a start. It's a start to get people to know the truth that, hey, these people were here. Did you realize that? And that's something that I often say in mine is that it's great you're all here. These people used to be here. What happened in between?
Yeah.
Find out something, anything as to what happened.
Yeah.
You can't just rattle it off. You have to sort of say something. Yeah.
And I think comes part of, I don't know, it just feels like having grown up part of my life in the Middle East and the conflicts that are happening there right now, I sort of have like both sides of the story. I have friends that are Palestinian, I have friends that are from Israel. So and I've had my own sort of enculturation both in my home country and in the US. So there's a lot of internal conflict that's happening in me right now where I'm like, either way, like a lot of lives are being lost.
Yeah.
But you bring up a point of how what do we need to do? And I always put it back on the nursing profession and on the individuals that how do we educate, right? And then I'm in academia, so how do we educate our students and our nurses so they are better informed and understand the history, and it's not just something they're getting out of small 10-second clips off of social media, right? And they get outraged over stuff. Sometimes well placed, sometimes not well placed because they don't have the full story. So I appreciate what you're mentioning is actually really understanding the words and the history behind things and really becoming more of an investigator. So we're better informed. So we touch on the points that we need to touch on. And at the end of the day, how do we make people's lives better? So right. I appreciate that. I want to be cognizant of our time. We have a few minutes left. Anything else you want to share with the audience would be wonderful.
Sure. And just going to your last point, what can nurses do or know, or schools of nursing, more like it. Coming from BC again, there was a mandatory course, which is the one I taught, co-taught, on Indigenous people's health promotion. It was mandatory. And I haven't seen that in the US. I haven't seen a mandatory course. And maybe if nurses were first made, I hate to say it that way, to learn this context, history, geopolitical, everything, historical trauma, structural racism, all of that in regards to the Indigenous population, we might be further down the road. Because if we just expect them to learn it on their own, unless somebody, 1% have an interest for whatever reason,
right? They're
not going to add to their, curriculum. And unfortunately, right now, it seems like most, I assume there's some in the West, I don't know. But most schools of nursing say, oh, we're packed to the gills. We couldn't put in one more credit of anything. This is what they need to do for the, NCLEX, et cetera, until schools of nursing and maybe even the NCLEX decide this isn't important enough. We need to start doing this, make it mandatory, make it universal, and have it done. But right now, I would assume, I haven't looked at people's curriculum, but I assume that there are some courses in nursing with Indigenous bents in the West, probably west of the Mississippi. But I bet you also that they're electives. I bet you it's not mandatory. And so how would we ever expect nurses to know what to do, what are the nuances, even the big ones, even big ones. Are you from a federally recognized tribe? Because now I can route you places or whatever. It's not just, I mean, I am American Indian and didn't learn, and I had all the same, schooling as everybody else, and I never learned one whit of any of this stuff. So
Very true. Yeah.
that's why I went to New Mexico and why I went to law school and took things like federal Indian law and so forth, because it doesn't just drop in your lap, and maybe it should. So
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think I've spoken to colleagues and they're like, well, it should be nurses' responsibilities. I'm like, but if we're waiting for the nurses to pick up on this on their own, we're in trouble, because people aren't necessarily, if it's not in their wheelhouse and it's not
on the test.
Exactly. If it's not on the test, if it's not on the NCLEX, it's not on a national board somewhere, we're more than likely it's not being taught. And unless we're bringing that information to them, actively bringing it to them and pushing them into that critical thinking role, a lot of times it won't happen on its own.
And as I said in one talk, when we did the evaluation of one of these classes, and this was like a 120-person class in Canada, they were awestruck. They were crying. They were, they're like, oh my gosh, I never knew any of this. Thank you. And it wasn't just us, the faculty. We brought in elders and people who had been in Indian hospitals, and theirs are pretty bad. Well, they don't even have them anymore. The residential schools, all the things that had happened, they had no idea. These, 20 to 30-year-olds, they didn't know any of it.
And that's again, one of the reasons, going back to my own vacations and road trips, is I want my girls to be exposed to the various things and the various cultures. And again, and we talk about it. We talk about, some of the issues and so, but if people don't get exposed to it, they're not going to follow up on it, or they're not going to want to know more. So that exposure is important.
It really is. And I do talks all around the country. And whatever state I'm in, I usually ask them, how many tribes are in this state?
Yeah.
And in 23 years, I've probably gotten 3 right answers. The people don't even know the tribes in their own states.
Yeah.
So
I don't.
Yeah. Look it up.
I'm going to do that right after. As soon as we end this, I'm going to, how many tribes in California? But very true.
You're right. LA County has the largest urban Indian population in the county. New York City has the largest urban Indian population in a city. There are like 110 to 17-ish thousand in New York. If it was a tribe or a reservation, it'd be like in the top 10. And yet there's not one Indian clinic. There's nothing. It was because of relocation. Same in California. There are tribes there, but also huge relocation policies that distribute them away from the land. But nothing set up, no infrastructure. There's not, to this day, at least the last time I looked, there wasn't any clinic in New York City, yet it has over 100,000 American Indians.
I know of one in LA, but I just know the one.
Yeah, I think there's probably, again, whenever
I'm
you're
sure
west
there's more.
of the Mississippi, it's a little better, but in the east, no.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I know you're super busy, and I appreciate the time you gave the podcast, so we can share your experiences and your knowledge. We have been listening to Dr. Margaret Moss. She is a professor at the University of Minnesota, an associate dean for nursing and health policy. Hopefully down the line we can collaborate. Veterans, I know you have a veteran connection. Veterans, Native American population. I think that'll be a wonderful opportunity for us to work together. So thank you, Dr. Moss. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to bringing our audience more incredible guests in the very near future. Thank you so much, and have a great one. You've been listening to the RN Mentor with your host, Ali Tayeb. Please don't forget to visit www.alirtayeb.com. That's www.alirtayeb.com for podcast notes and resources. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, I wish you fair winds and following seas.